mic on? Great. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming to Asset Recovery Speed Dating. Don't worry, this is not. We're not going to ask you to move around and date your neighbors. We are going to be speaking about a report. I should begin by saying my name is Anita Ramasastry. I'm the special representative to the OSCE on combating corruption, but it's really my great pleasure to introduce a panel today, a multi-stakeholder panel, that's going to focus on a report that we hope will be a useful tool to policymakers, civil society groups, law enforcement, and others, focusing on kind of the changing landscape of asset recovery and new innovations that will allow for civil society, for governments, and others to really make use of asset recovery procedures and then to actually, in an innovative way, use recovered assets. So we will begin with a sort of overview, because again, this is a joint project of the OSCE and the Basel Institute on Governance and their asset recovery program to create this incredibly comprehensive guide that covers over 18 jurisdictions and a wide variety of topics, and we're going to really explore that today. So we'll first hear from a colleague from the OSCE, Ralph Ernst, who is the Deputy Coordinator in the Office of the Coordinator for Economic and Environmental Activities of the OSCE, which is the second dimension. He'll give an overview, I think, of the OSCE's work in anti-corruption, and then we will actually hear from the person who has the hardest job, Andrew Dornberger, from the Basel Institute, who's going to actually, in a sort of short amount of time, cover that report in 18 jurisdictions. So, Ralph, welcome, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Anita, for the floor. Thanks all to you for joining us in this side event today. Anita, thanks again for organizing this important event. You introduced me. I'm working with the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. The OSCE is the world's largest regional security organization. We have a comprehensive approach to security, and preventing and combating corruption lies at the foundation of this approach and is one of the priorities of the office in which I work. This is the Office of the Coordinator of OSCE Economic and Environmental Activities. We promote international cooperation on economic issues, strengthen good economic governance, and assist our participating states in combating corruption, money laundering, and the financing of terrorism. This needs regional cooperation that includes state and local authorities, international and regional organizations, civil society, the private sector, academia, and think tanks. We do this through active contribution to international and regional fora and expert working groups. We work closely with, for example, with UNODC, with the OECD, with the Financial Action Task Force, and with others. And how do we operate? Upon request of our participating states, the OSCE conducts national anti-corruption scoping missions. During such missions, in-depth meetings are held with representatives of the relevant anti-corruption authorities, with prosecutorial bodies, financial intelligence units, but also with civil society, NGOs, and the private sector. And the result is then a detailed mapping of the remaining gaps and weaknesses of the anti-corruption institutional and regulatory setup, and a set of identified areas for targeted OSCE-led assistance in the areas of capacity building and technical assistance usually. Increasingly, our assistance is focusing on corruption prevention measures, asset recovery, anti-money laundering, and countering terrorism financing through national risk assessments, sharing of experiences and best practices, and training. So what can we offer? We are promoting the ratification and implementation of the UN Convention Against Corruption and the Financial Action Task Force recommendations on anti-money laundering and countering the financing of terrorism. We help improving national frameworks in these areas. We offer capacity building through experts as well as through sharing best practices and regional training activities for representatives of governments, the private sector, and civil society. We develop mechanisms for information sharing to more effectively identify, trace, and suppress money laundering and the financing of terrorism. We promote stolen asset recovery initiatives and strengthen international cooperation in financial investigations. I could continue this list, but in the interest of time, I move on to the main topic of this event today, to asset recovery. One of our flagship activities is dedicated to strengthening asset recovery capacities in the OSCE region, and we have so far focused on the Western Balkan region and Eastern Europe. Asset recovery is a tip of the anti-corruption spear because it denies corrupt criminals and organized crime their most precious reward, for which they are willing to even endure prison sentences, their money. We focus on strengthening the entire asset recovery process, from identifying, seizing and confiscating criminal assets to managing them in a cost-effective manner and repurposing them for social benefits. This activity is measurable with clear indicators of the value of seizures and thus can be evaluated to demonstrate the impact and utility. Targeting the ill-gotten gains of organized crime groups deprives these groups of power and influence, and the cost-efficient management and seized and confiscated assets and their reuse as community goods amplifies this impact, further contributing to a broader goal of justice, rule of law, and accountability. Our project is divided into 3 components, with the strengthening of regional cooperation being a cross-cutting element of the project. The first component focuses on enhancing the capacity of criminal justice practitioners to systematically identify criminal assets and apply asset seizure and confiscation measures. The second component focuses on improving informal cross-border exchange of information on organized crime cases among specialized, organized and economic crime prosecutors' offices and regional cooperation mechanisms. Specifically, we provide operational support to the Balkan Asset Management Interagency Network, BAMIN, and the Permanent Conference of Organized Crime Prosecutors. The third component of the project aims to increase the engagement of the public in the prevention of and fight against organized crime, especially through national and regional awareness raising and capacity building workshops that promote the social reuse of confiscated assets. We aim to extend this project to interested participating states in Central Asia, in particular with Kazakhstan. We are in in-depth conversations at the moment, following from their recent request to that effect, and we are consolidating our successful delivery in the Western Balkans in line with support to EU pre-accession objectives. These are a few examples of how we are working to support the global fight against corruption. We are ready to collaborate and share our knowledge and experience, and we look forward to crafting strong partnerships and joint efforts to our common aspiration to prevent and combat corruption. And I'm now looking forward to the interesting contributions from my fellow speakers here.
Great. Thank you so much, Ralph. So again, and for those of you who are interested in the Asset Recovery Project or the work of the OSCE, Ralph is here, as well as his colleague Marima Abdic, and you can raise your hand and wave, who you can speak to, I think, on the margins of the conference about the work that's ongoing, because it is multifaceted, and actually, as you're going to hear, I think, from our experts today, some really interesting innovations coming out of this work. I'm also pleased to say that part of the OSCE's work was partnering with the Basel Institute, and as we heard earlier today, we paid tribute to someone who has been quite a force in this field, and that is Greta Fenner. And it was really through her work and willingness to collaborate that we have this project that we have today, and the report that we're going to discuss. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, who is going to give us an overview of the report, Andrew Dornbeyer, who is a senior asset recovery specialist at the Basel Institute and the author of this study. So Andrew, welcome.
Thanks, Anita, and thanks for your kind words as well. It's obviously been a bit of a difficult time for the Institute, so it's nice to hear that sort of support. So, hi everyone. Welcome to our asset recovery speed dating session. My name's Andrew, as Anita said, and I was recently asked by the OSCE to conduct a comparative study of a selection of about 18 OSCE participating states, and in particular to look at the asset recovery legislative frameworks that exist in these states. And they're the 18 states for you. There were a couple of reasons for us doing this study. First, the OSCE wanted us to identify sort of some good established practices in this area. So to identify what asset recovery laws exist in exist in all of these countries that are working. And then secondly, another reason to do the study was actually to, more importantly, try and identify some less established asset recovery laws that exist in maybe one or some of these countries that are having some success or a lot of success in confiscating proceeds of crime. The idea here was we wanted to find some laws that maybe are a bit less known internationally, but which, like I said, are having some success, and which potentially some OSCE states who don't have these laws might find some inspiration in them, and potentially even add them to their own jurisdictions to reinforce their asset recovery frameworks. So how did we conduct this study, and what sort of laws were we looking for? So today I'm going to give a bit of an overview of the study, all right? I don't have a lot of time. The study was quite extensive, but I'm going to do my best to fit it all into about 10 minutes of my time. Before I get into it, I want to stress that this study is available for free online, okay? I'll put the link up on one of the final slides, so if you are interested in reading it, if you haven't read it, it is available for free online. So the study. As I said, generally we examined the asset recovery legislative frameworks of 18 states, okay? And when we did that, we were looking to see if they had one or all of these laws up on the slide here, okay? To start, we tried to establish if the state had a traditional conviction-based confiscation mechanism. For anyone not up to speed on the topic of asset recovery, these are really the standard baseline for asset recovery laws, and they basically allow a state to confiscate any established proceeds of crime that have been derived from an offence if a person has been convicted of that offence. Okay. Taking things a step further, we tried to establish whether or not certain states had extended confiscation laws. Once again, for those that don't really know what these are. These are also mechanisms that can only be activated once a person has been convicted of an offence. But the difference with these laws and the previous traditional laws above it were that basically, rather than just targeting the proceeds of crime that can be proven to have directly come from an offence, these laws can actually be used to target pretty much all the assets that someone owns around the time that they committed the offence. And they'll often even include a presumption that the court will impose on the person, which say that, well, all the assets that you had around the time that you committed this offence, we're going to presume that these are actually the proceeds of crime unless you can tell us otherwise. All right. Next, we looked to see if states had more broader asset recovery laws that don't necessarily rely on a conviction taking place. Okay. And these laws are known generally as non-conviction-based confiscation laws or non-conviction-based forfeiture laws. And these types of laws can actually be split into two subcategories of laws. And that categorization is based on whether or not they depend on the pre-existence of a criminal procedure. And the first category of these types of laws are sometimes called classic non-conviction-based confiscation laws. And these laws will basically permit the state to confiscate assets if a criminal procedure has been started, but then the criminal procedure can't be finished for some reason. So say there's a person who's been charged with a corruption offence, and a criminal procedure starts for that charge, and then this person gets sick or dies or runs away, then these types of laws will allow the state to still pursue the assets in question and any assets that might have been derived from the alleged corruption offence. Okay? The second category of these laws is often called civil recovery laws, sometimes called in rem laws, sometimes called civil forfeiture laws in the US, and these laws are even broader, right? So these non-conviction-based forfeiture laws don't depend on the pre-existence of a criminal procedure whatsoever. They'll allow a state to pursue any assets that they can prove to a civil standard are connected to criminality. Finally, when we did the study, we looked to see if states had any other laws that don't really fit into these more well-known categories of laws. So we looked to see whether or not states had any civil or criminal procedure-based unexplained wealth laws. We looked to see whether or not they had any information gathering, unexplained wealth powers as well. And we also looked to see whether or not they had any sort of asset recovery laws that could only be applied in certain specific situations. So, for example, sometimes a country will have an unexplained wealth law that can only be used to target assets that can be potentially linked to organised crime of some sort. So they're the type of the laws that we looked at. And now I'm just going to quickly go through some of the very general findings of the study. Okay? So all countries basically had these laws. That's not really surprising. Like I said, these are the baseline for asset recovery. Okay? But on top of that, pretty much all countries, I think except for one, had pretty broad extended confiscation laws. It wasn't so surprising. And the reason for this is because these laws have been recommended at an international level now for about 20 years. Okay, so there are EU framework decisions that have recommended these types of laws since about 2005, and even arguably the UNCAC has recommended both these top types of laws since around 2003. So it was good to see that all the states have implemented those sorts of recommendations. As we move down the pyramid, though, the existence of certain types of laws at the bottom of this period became less and less common. So only about 3/4 of the countries we looked at actually had classic non-conviction-based confiscation laws. This was a little surprising, personally, because like with extended confiscation, these sorts of laws have actually been recommended at an international level for quite a long time. They're not sort of new and innovative. They've been recommended in the UNCAC since around 2003. In the EU context, they've been recommended by the EU asset recovery directives for 10 plus years as well. So the fact that not all countries have adopted these types of laws was a little bit surprising. And then going down the pyramid one more level, very few countries actually had civil recovery or civil forfeiture laws out of the countries that we looked at. And for me, this was also a little bit surprising, and that's purely because the countries that do have these laws are actually using them with quite a lot of success. If you look at the civil forfeiture law in the US, for example, they've had a massive amount of success using that law for quite some time as well. Once again, when we got to the bottom category, so the others, when we were looking for unexplained wealth laws and things like that, these types of laws also became quite rare amongst the countries that we looked at. And for me personally, these types of laws are a pet topic of mine, and it was a bit surprising to see how little they'd been taken up by a lot of the countries that we looked at. And the reason for this is a lot of these laws, unexplained wealth laws, have also been recommended at an international level for quite some time. So if you look at three major sort of anti-corruption treaties, the UNCAC, the regional treaty in the Americas, and also the regional treaty in Africa, they all recommend these types of laws. So they are quite well-established practices internationally, but a lot of the countries we looked at have decided not to really take them up as of this time. So the question obviously is, why is this? Why have countries decided not to take up a lot of these types of laws? Well, to start, the laws at the bottom end of the pyramid, especially, a lot of them aren't really connected to criminal proceedings, and this makes legislators sometimes a little bit uncomfortable. Okay? Because they're not connected to criminal proceedings, they'll often also include lower standards of proof, and sometimes they can even include mechanisms that reverse the burdens of proof onto a person being targeted by these laws. And this doesn't really sit well with a lot of legislators in a lot of countries. Okay? And the reason for this is a lot of legislators will argue that these types of things potentially violate established legal rights. Okay? Regardless of these criticisms and these hesitations, it's fair to say that these types of laws generally, though, are increasingly being encouraged at an international level. Unexplained wealth laws, for example, and in particular the unexplained wealth laws I already mentioned, where they target assets connected to organised crime. These have recently been included in a European context in an amendment to the EU directive relating to asset recovery. Moreover, despite these hesitations, a lot of these laws are actually being accepted by courts in different parts of the world as not against human rights of different kinds. So once again, in the European context, there have been many cases in the last 20 years where laws that have similar characteristics to unexplained wealth laws or non-conviction-based forfeiture laws, these laws have actually been tested in front of the European Courts of Human Rights, and repeatedly the European Court of Human Rights has actually ruled that they're okay and they're in line with human rights, such as the right to the enjoyment of property and the presumption of innocence. So if you take all that into account, as a final point, while a lot of the countries that we looked at haven't really taken on a lot of these types of laws, I think it's pretty fair to say that going forward, a lot of these countries will, in the future, take on these types of laws, okay? Especially the European countries, as these types of laws become more and more accepted in a European context. I understand my time is probably up now, so I'm not going to go through all the different areas of the study, but I would like to highlight before I finish today.
Andrew, I was going to say, take a couple of minutes, if you want to talk about sort of what else the study goes into, please.
Okay, thanks. Okay. So the study does look at a lot of other best practices to do with asset recovery laws. Ralph sort of mentioned a few of the areas already when he was talking. So if you are interested in learning about best practices to do with the reuse of recovered assets, we cover that briefly in the study as well. And there are different methodologies that countries do actually use when it comes to the reuse of assets. And this is an area of law that it is changing somewhat going forward. So traditionally, countries would usually just recover assets and stick them in the treasury. But now there seems to be more of a tendency to actually reuse assets for specific purposes, for social causes and things like that. And a couple of members of our panel will probably touch on that as well today, so I don't need to go into that. The study also looks at a few of the common challenges relating to the implementation of asset recovery laws. But I won't go into that today either, because I know that at least one of our panel members is going to talk about that topic as well in a little bit more detail. But before I finish and before I get off the stage, I'd just like to highlight once again that if you are interested in what I've talked about today, that the study is available online for free. It's quite detailed, and I would highly encourage anyone who is interested to go and read it. And of course, if you've got any questions today, please shout out. And then if you've got any questions beyond today, feel free to reach out to me directly. I'll be more than happy to answer any questions related to the study. So thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Andrew. So we are going to delve now, I think, into the different facets of the study beyond just the legislative analysis. And so it's my great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, an expert who has been an expert actually to the OSCE Asset Recovery Project, which is Alberto Perduca, who is a chief prosecutor who has worked in this field extensively, not only in Italy, but also as the Director of Investigations and Operations at the European Anti-Fraud Agency, has worked with the EU Lex in the mission in Pristina, has had really a diverse and deep career in this field, and is going to speak about his perspective on non-conviction-based forfeiture and the experience in Italy, but also, I think, just more generally, the challenges of this type of legislation. So, Alberto, thank you so much.
Thank you, Anita. I used to be a prosecutor and to stand before the courts, so I will do the same before this distinguished audience. Well, let me first begin by saying that I appreciated a lot the guide illustrated by our panelist. I think it's a very good introduction, written in a concise and clear way to the topics of the asset recovery. And in the meantime, this guide shows how slow, difficult, but continuous is the development towards a set of legal tools which should enable states to tackle the illegal wealth accumulation in an effective way. I think that there is a widespread awareness that serious crimes, and namely profit-driven serious crimes, can be successfully fought, tackled, only if a double-track approach is followed. First, pursuing criminals, bring criminals to the courts, and get the sentence beyond a fair trial, and on the basis of evidence which goes beyond any reasonable doubt. But second, it's of the utmost importance to deprive them of their wealth, of their proceeds of crimes. I think there are at least 5 reasons, good reasons, to support this conclusion, because impoverishing criminals first make life of these criminals less attractive. Don't forget that most top criminals like a good life with high standards of living. So if you try to in some way disrupt this ratio of cost benefits, perhaps we can get some result. The second reason is that impoverishing criminals impede the reinvest in at least a portion of these proceeds in further criminal actions. Less money, less investments in further criminal actions. 3, it may weaken placing dirty money, or as we understood this afternoon, illicit financial flows in the legal market. Less money laundering. Less money makes perhaps corruption less easy. And I'm thinking to certain kinds of organized criminal groups, and namely to mafia-type groups. Less money may mean losing the grip of such groups on certain portion of the territories, on civil societies, on public institutions. Well, I think that we've been saying this since a long time, but despite this, results are still deceiving. We have to be frank, honest. It was reminded this afternoon by the moderator of the first panel. Let's take the example of the European Union. The European Union aims to be a common area of justice. I think it's quite unique laboratory in the world. We have common rules. We have a strong integration of the systems of criminal justice. We have invented the European arrest warrant, the mutual recognition of freezing and confiscating orders. We have invented the European investigative orders. All this in order to speed up and to build a mutual trust between the different agencies of different countries and be more effective in the fight against organized crime. But it was reminded this afternoon that the results on the asset recovery level are still very, very low, I would say very deceiving. Just 1% of the entire volume of the proceeds of crime are subject to confiscation. So that's to say, it's an estimation, of course, but it gives the idea that most of the proceeds of crime still remain in the hands, or better, in the pockets of criminals. So I think that a lot of job has was done, but a lot of job has to be done. And of course, the harmonization of different legislations in order to give to each state a kit of tools to attack the illegal patrimony is crucial, is essential, but we have to go beyond. And the second step is to build, train, strengthen law enforcement, prosecutors and judges, and by this way enable them in making the best use of the existing, the applicable legal tools, and seizing, freezing, confiscating the proceeds of crime in a more systematic and effective way. And I think it's worthwhile. In last fall, OSCE organized a training course for judges, investigators, judges, and prosecutors coming from some Western Balkan countries. And it was a training based on, quite interactive, based on cases. It was a cases was presented, and each group of prosecutors and judges explained how to deal with such cases on the basis of their legal framework. And it was a very creative exercise, and it showed that differences are not so huge. So that means that if we go on in this exercise, in this close context among the actors of the fight against organized crime and the actors of asset recovery, some good results should come quite soon. I just finished this first part of my speech, just listing the main loopholes that on the basis of my experience I could check in our job, in the job of prosecutors and investigators. In more than once, financial investigations, which are bound to track and then to freeze and then to confiscate assets, do not start promptly in parallel with criminal investigations. So, still, financial investigations are put a bit aside, are not taken as a priority, at least in some cases. These investigations, financial investigations, remain limited in the scope of traditional confiscation. The goal is to confiscate instrumentalities and direct proceeds of crime. Extended confiscation, for instance, is less implemented. These investigations neglect assets allocated abroad. I had a lot of junior prosecutors who took investigation abroad as something that took too many energies, too much time, with uncertain results. I think that we have to encourage people to be open to work with foreign colleagues, because there is a huge added value. Working with with colleagues coming from different systems is a real, very strong exercise of training. You get used to the flexibility, you try to find some maybe compromises in order to get the result, and so on. And last but not least, financial investigations do not sometimes cover all the areas of potential investment of financial illicit flows. There is just not one way of investing dirty money. There is some options. Luxury goods, real estate, companies, financing. So I think that we have to take into account all these options, and as investigators and prosecutors be sufficiently open to take all the opportunity that the case offers us. I conclude just with an encouragement. The guide for legislators is very good, very helpful. I would wish to see, ideally, a follow-up done by a guide for practitioners, investigators, judges, and prosecutors. It could be a good service for all those who like the rule of law and the justice. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Alberto. So, again, I think for the OSCE, they have a recommendation for a next part of their asset recovery project to move on from legislation to investigation and prosecution. Our next speaker is going to really speak about civil society and asset recovery, and I think, again, some innovations that are coming out of the OSCE region focusing on this concept of social reuse of assets. And so it's my great pleasure to introduce another colleague who has been a collaborator with the OSCE project, which is Radu Nicolai, who is with the Association for Cooperation and Sustainable Development, and will guide us through social reuse. Thank you, Radu.
Thank you, Anita. Thank all of you for attending our workshop. Thank OSCE for your excellent work in the region, in the Southeast region. I will speak from a civil society perspective. about the last phase of the asset recovery process. Asset recovery tends to be a very technical and hard topic. So most of the prosecutors I met say, yeah, it's not for the citizens. So my job here is to convince you and to convince our societies that citizens have a voice and civil society has to be involved in the entire process of asset recovery. So I say it's a great work, this guide, this study on legislation, because we need to have at least minimum standards, all of us. At the EU level, there are improvements nonetheless, but internationally, because assets tend to easily jump from one jurisdiction to another. So I will talk about social reuse practices, practices that I also worked along with OSCE to develop. So first I want to say something about what we did together with OSCE in 2021 and was very helpful, and we involved civil society in this social reuse part in Albania and North Macedonia. Actually, Albania has very good case studies and developments in using real estate, in transforming real estate into social enterprises. So we had 2 online workshops for Albania and North Macedonia, and out of these 2 days workshops we developed a SWOT analysis for the role of the civil society organization in the fight against organized crime, corruption, but also involving in the asset recovery process, and also an advocacy plan how to further reuse in this jurisdiction confiscated assets. And I agree with you that in order to have a social reuse, first we have to confiscate something. And confiscation, it's a really hard job. That's why I welcome your proposal to have also a practitioner guide. We need to identify, we need to trace, to identify, to seize, and then to confiscate assets in order to have something to reuse. But civil society is engaged not only in the last part of our process, it's the disposal part, in social reusing part, but also may help states, may help agencies in developing strategies, as I will show you. So OSCE also involved as a long partner of Libera in the activities of Chance Network, and I will talk a little bit more about the Chance Network as my association that I represent, Association for Cooperation and Sustainable Development in Romania, is part of this network of civil society organizations. It's a young network, Chance, established in 2019, but for the last 4 years we've managed to involve citizens, especially young people, in understanding what asset recovery is about and what confiscated asset means. Because in 2020-2021 we did the first mapping of the social reuse practices and a monitoring toolkit for civil society organization, because one of the job of us is to keep the agencies accountable, that the process is really happening. Then we developed a workbook and toolkits also for civil society, how to involve young people in giving a new life to confiscated assets, property. Here, as you all know, because you're professionals in this field, Italy has maybe the best practices in social reusing real estate. But I think in other parts of the world, and Albania showed us clearly that it is possible with great success. Then we developed the Chance Manifesto, and I will shortly say some words about it. And also we're involved because we recently had EU elections. We were involved as a network to inform citizens about rule of law in general, but of confiscated assets and asset recovery in the context of EU election. In the next years, in all the countries of the Chance Network, we'll have social reuse youth summer schools in which we will involve young people in understanding the danger of organized crime and corruption, and also to show them that criminal assets did not stay with them, and they are actually used for the benefits of societies. I invite you to look for our Chance Network manifesto. It's called The Chance for Europe because it tackles several key issues. And in the center we have this common goods, confiscated goods from organized crime and corruption. These goods may come from organized crime, from human trafficking, from drug trafficking, for all sorts of illegal activities. They can come from corruption or from environment crimes, as we learned today. This is a really hot topic. And eco-mafias are developing all over the world. And it's important to give these assets back to communities, to show these assets and communicate about these assets. And with the help of these assets to ensure protection and repatriation and allowing damages for the victims of such crimes. So this is, in a nutshell, our manifesto. So it's much broader, so I invite you to read it. We also work at the EU level. We were involved in the consultation process regarding the new confiscation directive. We've urged for improved rules, minimum rules on social reuse. Also, we are very active at the EU Network Against Corruption, newly formed EU network. Also, we had also different participation, different events and consultation regarding this new directive. In my last part of the presentation, I will show you some good examples from my country of origin, from Romania, in advancing this agenda of social reuse. Because we started in 2014, 2015, and we have some results that shows this is a good path to go forward. And also, I was asked by our colleagues from the Republic of Moldova to tell you that they're also engaged on this path. They are building now a strong institution, anti-corruption institution, and they are committed to have a law on social reuse this year. So in Romania, apart from the awareness and education activities that we do with young people, for instance, here is a recent picture about a discussion we had in a high school near Bucharest, which has some organized crime problems, and we engage with the young people, explaining that it may seem very, I don't know, glamorous or very nice to check on Instagram those people bragging with their assets, but in fact this is not the way to go forward. And I show them, you know, this Tate brother, this is quite a big case in Romania, that show off with their cars and illicit gain assets. Look, these assets were seized, and there were movies of the law enforcement seizing those assets. So apart from this awareness and education, we managed in Romania to put back in 2015 a law saying that In 2015, there were all the money from the confiscation, but now 50% of the money confiscated goes to different projects put forward by law enforcement agencies, by ministries, education, health, but also by civil society organization. And this year, we've managed in Romania to sign the first 3 grant contract from confiscated money, giving them to services for victims. And civil society organizations were involved in the consultation over the guide for applicants. You see there a picture of a debate we had as part of a project on how to build this grant scheme. So next year we will have more money and hopefully more projects. Also from confiscated money we managed to have this emergency vouchers for crime victims. We developed a scheme. We involved civil society organization as the organization that are in contact with the victim and gives the victim the card, the credit card, the debit card with this money. It is approved by a judge, is up to 5 medium salaries for a victim. For this year, we have budgeted 300 such vouchers, so up to 3,300 euro per victim. Also, we have 2 examples of public reuse of real estate. I didn't put pictures here, but there are 2 buildings, one in the center of Bucharest reused as a headquarters office for a public institution under the Ministry of Justice, and another one reused by a mayor's office to transform it into elderly house. And all these were based on a very well crafted national asset recovery strategy. Over 100 civil society organizations in Romania participated in the consultations over this strategy. So thank you so much, and looking forward to your question.
Thank you. So, and again, the asset recovery report and study looks at social reuse and legislation as well. So again, it's another piece and important component. Human rights as well. We heard earlier about the need for human rights and protection of those whose assets may be confiscated. And so our last speaker is going to speak about one other piece that the guide looks at, which is the sort of human rights and due process dimension of asset recovery. So we're really pleased to welcome someone from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, who is their focal point on issues relating to corruption and human rights, and that is Maria Jose Varamendi-Villa. So welcome, Maria Jose, and you can speak about the High Commissioner's work on human rights and asset recovery. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Anita.
Everyone in this panel likes to stand.
Well, thank you, Anita, and thank you to the OSCE for the invitation and the possibility for the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights to be present in this panel and to share the work that we are doing on anti-corruption and human rights, the very much importance of asset recovery in this context. And I just want to start by sharing a little bit of what the mandate of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights is. The first and most fundamental part of our mandate is the promotion and protection of human rights. We contribute to increased awareness and engagement by the international community and the people on human rights issues. We provide technical assistance to states on human rights issues. And finally, we mainstream human rights into all programs to ensure that the 3 pillars of the UN, that is, peace and security, development, and human rights, are interlinked and they're mutually reinforced. OHCHR's work on corruption and human rights is victim-centered. And in that context, it's really important for the office to highlight the negative impact that corruption and illicit financial flows have on human rights, as they divert the scarce resources from the full realization of human rights. They drain the public budgets that are meant for housing, education, public essential services such as health care, and it gives rise and it also deepens inequalities. And it has a destructive effect on the capacity of the states to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights. And they impact mostly people and groups in situations of vulnerability and marginalization. Particularly, it impacts disproportionately youth, migrants, people and communities experiencing discrimination, including discrimination by disabilities, youth, I mentioned migrants before, older persons, indigenous peoples, and ethnic minorities, and they're often exacerbated along gender lines. OHCHR has been working on the issue of corruption and human rights and illicit financial flows for many years. And since 2011, the Human Rights Council has been engaged with the issue of illicit financial flows, and particularly through a resolution on the negative impact of non-repatriation of funds of illicit origin to the countries of origin on human rights and on the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. Actually, in February this year, the Human Rights Council had mandated an expert meeting on the obstacles to non-repatriation of funds of illicit origin to the countries of origin. Many of the experts that participated on this meeting are in this room today. And actually, the report on that meeting is being presented right now to the Human Rights Council. In this context, the guide is an excellent tool, and we think that it's complementary. We have also a tool that is complementary to the guide. And I want to particularly highlight from the guide the chapters 4 and 5. Chapter 4 that refers to the compatibility of asset recovery mechanisms with human rights, what Anita was mentioning, due process, the right to property. And the next chapter on the social reuse that was recently, the recent example that was presented by Radu on social reuse. Another tool that OHCHR developed and that was launched in 2022 are the recommended principles on human rights and asset recovery. This recommended principles on human rights and asset recovery recognize that stolen assets and corruption more broadly are human rights issues, and they have a negative impact on the realization of human rights. Corruption undermines what I mentioned at the beginning, and the guide, the recommended principles emphasize that corruption impacts negatively the possibility of states to use the maximal available resources to fulfill economic, social, and cultural rights. And also corruption is a human rights issue because anti-corruption and asset recovery process can themselves infringe the enjoyment of human rights. And states have obligations to take anti-corruption measures and to do so in a manner that is consistent with their human rights obligations. The recommended principles on human rights and asset recovery are designed to support international cooperation in the context of asset recovery, and they detailed a human rights-based approach to the recovery and return of the proceeds of corruption, and they provide also best practices. They highlight ways into which human rights law and anti-corruption law can act as mutually reinforcing bodies of law. The recommended principles contain 9 recommended principles, and they cover all the phases of the asset recovery process, including prevention, detection of corruption, tracing of proceeds of corruption, and the preservation and confiscation of proceeds of corruption, and finally the return and allocation of the proceeds of corruption. As I was saying a moment ago, the guide, the tool, the study that was presented today, we hope that the recommended principles can actually complement the study. And particularly, and just to finalize, I would highlight just two principles that are very much in line with chapters 4 and 5 of the study, which would be principle 7, that is, receiving states should allocate returned assets in an accountable, transparent, and participatory manner, and principle 8, that is, receiving states should use recovered assets in a manner that contributes to the realization of human rights, and this very much points out to the social reuse that was recently explained to us. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So I think of our panelists, most have concluded, but Alberto, did you have...
Just to...
Okay, so if you want to maybe just a couple of other points, and then what we're going to do after that is we're going to come to the floor for questions and comments, and then we'll have some concluding remarks, especially from Andrew and Ralph. So please.
Okay, very quickly.
And I'm not sure if, in terms of questions, whether we'll have microphones in the audience.
What was said, my previous panelist introduces what I wanted to say about the respect of fundamental rights in a special procedure that we have in my country, which is bound to get the confiscation of assets as preventive measure, not as criminal sanction, but as preventive measure. Just to put things in a simple way, 3 requirements have to be met in order to get this kind of confiscation. First, it's to the prosecutor to prove, of course, by circumstantial evidence, that there are grounds to believe that the concerned person lives off the proceeds of crime. So the standard of proof is lower. No, we do not have to prove beyond any doubt that the person is guilty, but that there are reasonable grounds to believe that the person lives off the proceeds of crime. And we can do it on the basis of a multiplicity of indicators, criminal records, pending trial, standard of life. We have to check whether the person works or not, what is her legal income, and so on. Then it's to the prosecutor to prove that the value of the patrimony is disproportionate with respect to the legal income. And third, it's to the concerned person and his or lawyer to allege, at least allege in a credible way, that the assets have a licit legal origin. And parenthesis, this is the field of the triumph of imagination, because in most of the cases we face some uncles from America that left a legacy, lottery gains and insurance refunds or compensations. And of course, it's to the prosecutor to check and to double check. I must say that in the last decades, most of the assets confiscated in my country have been done and decided within this quasi-criminal parallel procedure. And now, more and more, this preventive measure is becoming controversial. More and more, it is criticized because of not respect of fundamental rights. It's against the presumption of innocence. Is the confiscation a measure not proportionate, and so on. And there is also a pending case before the Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg. And I think that probably this preventive measure that was totally successful needs some adjustment in order to find a better balance between the interest for depriving criminals of their proceeds and in the meantime to respect the fundamental rights. With regard to, I conclude, with regard to the reuse of assets, I would say that thanks to the success of this the application of this preventive measure, during the last decades, a huge amount of assets were confiscated. And this generated major issues in their management. And the agency, the national agency that is called to do this job, has some problems. Management costs, and not always it is possible to reuse these assets, giving them to local municipalities, public administration, or non-governmental associations, organizations. So here again, some adjustments need to be done. Take into account that the philosophy of the law related to the focused on the reuse of confiscated assets expressed a clear favor of reuse and much less favor for selling such assets. The fear was that if we sell too much, the risk that organized groups go back and buy again such assets. I think that here again we need a more balanced, that's my personal assessment, a more balanced approach. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much. And again, additional work for the Asset Recovery Project. And the issue of asset management is yet another part of this project in terms of building networks around how you manage the property, the yachts, the cars, everything that is confiscated. Before we go back for some closing remarks, we do have time for either comments or questions from the floor. So I see a hand over here. So if you could introduce yourself, and if there are others, please raise your hand. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, no. Hi, my name is Maria Fernanda. I work for Transparency International UK, and we are working specifically on a paper about asset return. And my question for the panel, and more specifically for Radu, I think, is what happens with when the assets that you recover are not returned and are not reinvested socially. So in international cases, according to UNCAC, in many cases, the money should go back to the country of origin of the money. In local cases, I suppose, it should go back to the original victims. What happens in terms of what are the consequences of this money not going back to the victims that originally were the owners of this money?
Okay, good question. Are there other comments and questions before we go back to the panel? Okay, so I think we'll take two more. So we have someone here, and then... Okay, we'll come back.
Thank you for this interesting panel. My name is Dan Clayman. I'm with the U.S. Department of Justice, and I was curious about the studies look at the different legislation and how it's less common across different systems to have the non-conviction-based judgments and or proceedings. And as you pointed out, UNCAC recommends this now for 20 years. The EU, however, has had experience with mutual recognition of orders. And I was wondering if there's any experience from the EU mutual recognition that will maybe help understand how countries can or can't recognize non-conviction-based judgments in another court. So if one country does have non-conviction-based tools, can they get their judgments enforced in another country? I think we, anyway, are still having difficulty with the enforcement of our judgments because a lot of countries don't recognize non-conviction-based forfeiture or don't have it themselves, notwithstanding the framework decisions and EU directives that are popularizing that more in Europe. Thanks.
Thank you. And then we had one more.
Thank you. My name is Peter Jonath. I work with GIZ in Iraq. Thank you for the very vibrant discussion. One of the questions I have, you did a study on legislation, that pyramid. One of the issues that has been raised is mutual legal assistance. And how do you, if you look at the studies, go that step further and look at best practice in the different jurisdictions in Europe in terms of mutual legal assistance, particularly for jurisdictions outside of the EU?
Okay, great. So why don't we go back to the panelists, and I think, again, we'll probably have time for one more round of questions and comments. So Radu, why don't we start with you, and then we'll go back to Alberto and Andrew on some of the questions regarding legislation and mutual legal assistance.
Thank you for the question. Indeed, repatriation is an important topic because the assets or money should return, especially from corruption, to the country of origin. And there is, I think, no magical solution. It depends from a case to case, and when you put that question, I remembered a good example from the Republic of Moldova, where assets were returned actually from UK, were returned based on a civil confiscation procedure out of the son of a former Prime Minister of Moldova, who had a luxurious life, the Prime Minister being convicted for corruption. Maybe you know the case. And when the UK and Moldova agency got together and say how we should proceed with this repatriation process, it was this idea how this money can be used in a valuable social way, not to be just put it into the state budget. So the UK counterparts, although there were no legislation at that moment in Moldova, they came with this idea, this money to be reused in social work. For this money to pay salaries for additionally 500 new social workers for disadvantaged people with disabilities, and also in order to ensure the sustainability, then the state to continue covering the salaries of this person after the money from confiscation were over. So indeed, it was a country-to-country mechanism that functioned, and the money were returned to Moldova, were used and were monitored by a civil society organization. The disbursement of the money was monitored by a civil society organization. At the end, a report was made public, and this shows that although the legal framework may not be compatible, in cooperation we may find alternatives, money not to just go into the state budget to be defrauded once more into corruption schemes.
Great, thanks. And Andrew, why don't we go to you and then to Alberto on the questions?
Yes, I try to answer to the questions related to the mutual legal assistance. Well, within the European Union, we have a regulation, I think dated 2018, which foresees the mutual recognition of freezing and confiscated orders. That is to say that provides a very accelerated procedure in order to execute in the requested country orders coming from the requesting country. We are within the European Union. Just to come back to the preventive confiscation in the Italian system, well, it's not written in the regulation clearly that the regulation of mutual recognition is applicable to the cases of preventive measures, but is not forbidden. So there is a margin for a certain interpretation in order to make to grant also to this kind of preventive confiscation the mechanism of mutual recognition. Out of the European Union, that depends case by case, of course. I worked for 10 years into district close to the Switzerland on one side and to Principality of Monaco, both countries quite attractive for capitals, and we had 2 cases where we got from Italian courts orders of freezing and confiscated orders within the preventive measure procedures, and we request assistance to the Swiss authority and to the Monte Carlo authority, the assistance in order to freeze and confiscate the assets. And I must say that in both cases the answer was positive. So both Swiss authorities and Monaco authorities thought that preventive measure procedure was in some way could be assimilated to a criminal procedure because it was decisions were done by judges, were done by an adversarial stage of the proceedings based on solid grounds. So these both freezing and confiscated orders were worthwhile to be executed in their countries. In both cases, at least in one case, the sum was more than 1 million euros put in a Swiss bank. It was a trigger. It followed the mechanism of sharing followed. So 50-50, 50% for Swiss authorities because they cooperated, and 50% for the Italian authorities who did the job. So that's the usual mechanism when there is cooperation between different states. I had a third case, I remember, a third case with Luxembourg, a third interesting country for investments, and we requested within the procedure of a preventive measure assistance, not for executing an order, but just to get information, bank information, financial information, and once again, Luxembourg judiciary thought that it was worthwhile to cooperate, and they gave us all the information we requested.
Great. Thank
So
you.
that's
Great.
the
Andrew,
state
do
of
you want to
art.
answer the question, though, about recognition of judgments in terms of non-conviction-based forfeiture?
Yeah, sure. Is my microphone on?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so to be honest, this is not just a US problem. This is an international problem, the mutual recognition of judgments in other jurisdictions that relate to laws that one other jurisdiction might not have. And, you know, there are examples in Europe that can go both ways. First of all, I know of an example in Europe where France, for instance, didn't recognise unexplained wealth judgments that were coming out of Senegal, I think it was. And it was a pretty good example of an obvious case where someone had proceeds of crime in a European jurisdiction. A due process had occurred that identified that these assets were quite obviously not from lawful sources, but the European jurisdiction still refused to really recognise this judgment. And I think that's a good example to highlight the fact that it's not just the US that are dealing with this problem. This is a common problem everywhere. In saying that, though, just to be a bit positive, I'm not an expert on all the judgments that exist around on this particular issue, but if I recall correctly, there is an example where I think it was the Swiss who did recognise a judgment in the UK that related to a civil recovery order, okay? And if I remember correctly, the way that they did that was that rather than focusing on you know, the technicalities involved, what they did is they looked at the bigger picture of the case, and I think they realised that the facts of the case and the case that they were looking at would actually fall under, I think it was their money laundering offence, which was wide enough to capture basically the same facts that the UK had used to prove a civil recovery order. And I think that's an important lesson to have. So as long as if you don't want to introduce civil recovery legislation, or you don't want to legislate for unexplained wealth laws and things like that, one way that at least you can potentially help the countries that do have these laws is by making sure that other offences that you have on your books are sufficiently wide enough to capture a broad range of facts that might be used in these other jurisdictions to use these types of laws. Okay. In terms of the MLA question, listen, this is a tough one, right? It's a very common challenge. The ineffectiveness of mutual legal assistance processes around the world. This is something that exists everywhere. It's something it's going to be very, very difficult to tackle because every country has their own individual problems. It's a very nuanced issue, this one. It's not just a matter of capacities, which is definitely the case in many countries. It's also, most of the time, a matter of resources, okay? So even if you have a good mutual legal assistance process in place in a particular country, if you don't actually grant adequate resources to the people that are in charge of making sure these processes work, mutual legal assistance will take too long, it'll be too slow, and it won't help anyone. So this is, honestly, this is a challenge that is very widespread. I'm afraid my answer on this is quite negative because I don't know what the solution is with regards to mutual legal assistance, but I would agree wholeheartedly that it's a topic that needs to be looked at much more closer going forward. And perhaps it's a topic it's a little bit due for solutions, okay? Technology has advanced, yet with many mutual legal assistance processes, we're literally sending hard copy letters from one country to another, which is ridiculous, really, based on the fact that technology now has advanced so much further than that. So perhaps it is an issue that does need to be looked at, and perhaps it's about time that we came up for solutions on making this whole process much more effective.
Great, thanks. Do we have any other questions? So I see two more. So we'll take those two questions, and then we're going to come back to our panel for their final observations.
Thank you. Tatiana Hudor, Kyiv-based legal think tank, Institute of Legislative Ideas, and visiting professor in George Mason University in U.S. I have a tricky question. The U.S. actively uses civil forfeiture for the sanction evasion cases. So there was, there was a precedent, Malafeyev case, and around $5.5 million have been already transferred indirectly to Ukraine to help Ukraine, to support Ukraine as a victim of this aggression, an indirect victim of this crime. So as for now, there is much more than $5 million. There is around half of the billion dollars that was seized within the over 70 cases sanction evasion. So what needs to be done to multiply this precedent? It's first question, and what Ukraine have to do in this case to send request or not, because it's not the country of origin. So what the mechanism you prefer to use in this case? Thank you.
Thank you. And then we had one more.
No idea.
Thank you very much, and
This is challenging.
I want to congratulate the panelists for sharing this study. And I take it that this is a pilot, and my question is twofold. Are you planning to extend it? Because I noticed from the list you have that you only reflected what is called requesting countries under the UNCAC. I don't see among the countries the requesting countries. And for them, the output of this study could form a moral justification for continuing to demand for the return of their assets. Sorry, I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Lillian. I'm from Nigeria. Secondly, for the person from the Office of the High Commission on Human Rights, thank you also for drawing attention to the principles. I'll certainly look it up. My question is, do the principles also reflect the human rights issue for the persons who are accused of crimes?
Thanks. So as we conclude and go back, so Maria Jose, maybe we'll begin with you. If you can answer that question and maybe reflect on what you've heard today.
Yes. Thank you, Anita. To respond to the question immediately, yes, the principles do refer to that. Actually, Principle 5 is states should take effective measures to ensure that human rights of persons under investigation for, accused of, or convicted of corruption and money laundering offenses are subject to asset recovery procedures, and their rights are guaranteed during the whole process of investigation and conviction. So the recommended principles are actually quite comprehensive and in that matter. And as a matter of conclusion and reflection, and I was also thinking about Maria Fernanda's question on what happens when the assets cannot be returned, where they cannot be socially reused. The victims of corruption have a right to remedy and to redress as victims, and this is one of the main guidelines. It's established, of course, in the UNCTAD Convention, the right to remedy, to reparation, and it's one of the main guidelines of the work of OHCHR during this past 2 years, where we have been working on a global multi-year comprehensive strategy on anti-corruption and human rights. This strategy has a broad vision for the work of the office, and it's a vision that also starts with prevention of corruption as a human rights issue. And it's a vision where states adopt anti-corruption measures and their efforts are consistent with their human rights obligations and have a victim-centered approach, and where human rights violations that result from corruption-related offenses are investigated with a focus on prevention, effective administration of justice, and redress for victims of corruption. And I often repeat and highlight in every opportunity I have the negative impacts of corruption in the enjoyment of human rights, the negative impacts of illicit corruption-associated illicit financial flows, and in the obligations, and in the end, the impact this has on the states to be able to allocate their maximum available resources for the fulfillment of human rights, for the fulfillment of all human rights, including the right to development, including environmental rights, economic, social, and cultural rights, political, civil, and political rights, all in equally same standing and indivisible, interdependent as they are. I think because at the beginning we were talking about challenges and lessons learned. I think for the office, one of the main challenges and lessons learned of the process while developing this strategy on anti-corruption and human rights, and I recall there was mentioned this morning, is the importance of partnerships. Building partnerships with other UN agencies, as the mandate of OHCHR is also to mainstream human rights in the work of all other UN agencies, but also build partnerships with academics, with think tanks, with civil society. Civil society plays an essential role in the fight against corruption, and also in the search for accountability of human rights violations that result from corruption-related offenses. And this is essential. Full transparency, participation, access of information in all of the context of the anti-corruption fight, asset recovery, asset return processes to ensure that victims actually receive an effective remedy.
Great, thanks.
Thank you,
I see the
Anita.
clock ticking down, so
Yes.
brief remarks, Radu?
Yes, I think we all struggle with legal frameworks, and maybe I know that Council of Europe started a process that will end this year to draft a new directive, or a new convention on asset recovery, and hopefully this convention will go beyond what is in the EU directive right now. And standardize and set the minimum standard higher than it is now. But don't forget about non-cooperative jurisdictions around the world. And maybe we have to also think about giving some political signals that non-cooperation in the field of asset recovery is a minus, and maybe improve our legal instruments and international conventions that we have already in place, I mean UNCAC, to ensure a better response and as some panelists said, that we need, Andrew said that we need an improved mutual legal assistance system that is updated to the times that we live in.
Thanks. Alberto?
No, I just think into the question related to the freezing of assets belonging to Russian oligarchs after the aggression of Russia against Ukraine. I think, at the best of my knowledge, at least in my country, these freezing orders have been taken by administrative governmental authorities, not by neither prosecutors nor judges. So we are out of criminal or quasi-criminal proceedings. And this is good, because if we enter into the criminal dimension, we would face some very sensitive questions. Are these criminal sanctions? Who is guilty? Is there an issue of the irretroactivity of the criminal law? So I think that things would be more and more complex. So far, we are before administrative decisions, governmental decisions, and I read that there are some issues not yet fixed in order to decide what is the destiny of such assets. So now there are some decisions to use the interests of the money frozen, but what about the money? So I think it's an open question, and criminal justice so far has nothing to say.
Andrew?
Is this to answer questions or just general wrapping up?
Yeah, both.
A bit of both. Well, given the time, the Ukraine one and the US, I think that's a bit tough to cover in 2 minutes and 46 seconds, which we have less. But if you'd like to, I can have a chat to you after. That's definitely not a simple question. I'm not from the US, but I would like to highlight that they are leading the charge on this, at least. So even if there are a lot of assets there that have been frozen, they haven't been recovered, they haven't been put to Ukraine, at least they're getting those first pivotal decisions that hopefully will lead to many more decisions going forward. In terms of just wrapping up completely, and to maybe drag things back to the study itself, I actually just wanted to echo something that Alberto sort of highlighted in his talks. The study is really only half the picture. The study really was just looking at the legislation that exists in different countries, okay? And the final message I wanted to leave everyone with was you can literally have the best asset recovery legislative framework in the world. If you don't implement it properly, if you don't put the right sort of resources into the implementation of this actual framework, if you don't have investigators that understand that this framework exists and actually use the framework as one of the priorities of their investigation from the start, then what's the point, right? What's the point of having an asset recovery legislative process and a legislative framework that is excellent if no one's going to use it? So this is only half the picture. And I hope that we can continue to work together and do more works and more studies that look at actually the implementation of the findings in this study in a way that we see more assets actually recovered.
Great. Thanks so much, Andrew. And I think that leaves us to Ralph, who could speak, I think, a little bit about maybe the future directions of the asset recovery work and the OSCE's involvement.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, for me, this was a very productive panel. We had inputs from the work that we had done. And I could see even the engagement between the panelists. There were a number of suggestions on how we can make further steps, and that we are half the way, maybe not even there. But there's quite a lot more that we can do. I thought it was all very productive. That was all interesting suggestions, and enough material to write the next project document, I think. Yeah. In addition to that, I mean, I mentioned before that we are in the process of expanding regionally. Yeah, we are expanding into Central Asia. We have, as a matter of fact, this week we have a conference in Almaty in Kazakhstan, a regional conference on asset recovery. We've brought a delegation from Albania to this conference to share their experiences, because we have worked with Albania in the past. So this is the kind of fruitful discussions and engagements that we are that the OSCE is trying to provide and to facilitate. That's what we can do. And that will also be part of the future work on asset recovery in general.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Ralph. And I really have to say again that what you're seeing with this panel, but the work of the asset recovery, is that the legislative guide is really one piece, but that you've really approached the whole topic with a much more holistic approach of dealing with the different phases and stakeholders involved. So please join me in thanking the panel, and hopefully it's provided you some interest in the guide. And I think there's some quick guides and shorter pieces of the guide if you don't have the sort of ability to read the whole thing. So join me in thanking our panel. And hopefully they'll stick around for a few minutes afterwards to answer other questions individually. So thank you so much.
Dear guests, we would like to invite you to an opening party which will begin very, very soon. And you can find that hall right in the front of this building. So see you there and have a good evening.